Tonight, the first tape of Donald Trump talking to Michael Cohen has been released, and there are 11 more audio tapes that the feds have seized from Trump's attorney's office. We're going to ask a former federal prosecutor how damaging this could all be. Also, we will take a look at the latest from D.C. Tariffs, a trade war, more damage control over Russia, and an immigration mess that keeps getting messier. ABC News political director Rick Klein will join us. Then our legal panel will join us. Take a look at several big stories in the news, including Alex Jones trying to have his Sandy Hook defamation case tossed, and a stand your ground case in Florida that is drawing a ton of controversy. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us. It is Wednesday, and that means we have a lot of legal news. And of course, some of that deals with President Trump and the Russia probe. We begin with the audio tape of Trump and his former attorney, Michael Cohen, that has just been released.
President Trump is lashing out at his former attorney Michael Cohen after a secret recording of one of their conversations became public. The president tweeted, "What kind of lawyer would tape a client? So sad. Why was the tape so abruptly terminated, cut, while I was presumably saying positive things?" The tape, which Cohen recorded without Trump's knowledge 2 months before the election, appears to show then-candidate Trump discussing the National Enquirer's parent company, AMI's purchase of a story from former Playboy playmate Karen McDougal, who claims she had an affair with Trump. The White House denies the affair.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info.
At the time of the recording, AMI had already bought McDougal's story for $150,000, but decided not to publish it before the election. Cohen and Trump seemed to discuss setting up a shell company to purchase the rights to the Enquirer's story after the fact.
Give it to me when it comes time for the financing, which will be...
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
I'll pay the cash.
No. I got... No.
That ending is now in dispute. Cohen's attorney claims Trump's mentioning of cash suggests he's prepared to engage in illegal activity.
The word is cash. Everybody should listen to the tape and see whether I'm right or not.
The president's attorney argues otherwise, telling Fox News Trump wanted any potential transaction handled by check for documentation.
We listened to it numerous times, and the transcript makes it quite clear at the end that President Trump says, quote, "Don't pay with cash."
By the way, the feds also seized 11 other audio tapes from Cohen's office, but it is unclear what's on them and whether they'll ever hear them. That's not the only thing that Trump has to worry about, of course. Paul Manafort, his trial starts next week. It was delayed by a week for procedural issues, but the judge has granted immunity for 5 witnesses who will testify. Then there is the open question as to whether or not Trump will ever sit down with Mueller. Trump has said that he wants to, but his legal team keeps changing the terms or moving the goalposts. Now, Rudy Giuliani saying the president could sit down for questions about collusion with the Russians, but he will not talk about possible obstruction of justice. Well, here to help us sort this out, as he does every week, former federal prosecutor Roland Riopel. And there never is a week where we don't have news relating to the president and this probe. And let's first start with those audio tapes. Of what came out and the payments and everything else, why isn't this John Edwards all over again and all the trouble he got into with campaign funds being used potentially here to keep, obviously, the salacious story quiet?
Richard, it sure sounds like devastating proof of that kind of crime. The tape as a whole includes discussion of having to keep things quiet for the next couple of months while the election is going on and things like that. And another very interesting and damning part of the tape is Cohen's mention of Alan Weisberg, Trump's accountant in the Trump organization. So it sounds like there are lots of witnesses, including Mr. Weisberg, who know something about this transaction and can testify about it. The tape itself is basically 2 guys plotting the crime of campaign finance violations, and that's why it was disclosed. This is not a privileged conversation. You cannot plot with your lawyer a crime and keep that conversation under wraps by asserting the attorney-client privilege. I think the Trump campaign knew, or the Trump group knew, that this tape was coming out, because it falls under the crime fraud exception of the attorney-client privilege, and they decided to try to get in front of it with their attempts to spin it as a positive thing for Trump, which is just mashugana, to use the legal term.
Well, Lanny Davis, who knows his way around these kind of stories,
Right.
he made it clear that he thought there was a big distinction whether it was cash or check. Explain why, and he talked about the only people who deal with cash, drug dealers and money launderers. Where's he going with this?
Well, you know, if the cash there being discussed, and it sounded to me like it's Mr. Trump who says, let's pay cash, right? That's what it sounds like to me on the tape, despite what Mr. Giuliani says. You know, you pay in green cash like that if you don't want to leave a record. You hear Michael Cohen disagree with Trump and say, no, at the end of the tape there. But, you know, that's why drug dealers and money launderers and people like that frequently do use green cash, because it doesn't leave any kind of trail. And that would be the argument here.
So explain to me, there's 12 tapes. Obviously, we've heard the first one. Who knows what's on the other 11 tapes other than the feds? And why would there be a decision to push this one out there now when there could be either damning or inconsequential stuff on the other 11?
You know, I'm not sure exactly why the decision was made by the Trump campaign to focus on this tape now. It may be, Richard, that this is the worst of the tapes, and so the Trump team feels like this is the one they need to spin the most, and that's why they focused on it. The other tapes, if they're in the hands of the Southern District now, given and have been given these tapes by the special master, that means that they are not attorney-client privileged. And that could be for one of two reasons. Either Mr. Cohen is speaking to someone who is not his client, a newspaperman, a reporter or something, for example, or they could be tapes between Cohen and Trump in which they are arguably discussing further criminality, in which case the crime fraud exception applies. Those are the two ways that these tapes could get into the hands of the government, and we just don't know how bad those ones are until we take a look at them and hear them. I'm wondering how bad a client do you have to be that your own lawyer decides to tape you? Oh my gosh. You know, we've all had difficult clients, but clearly Michael Cohen gets the full-on Trump, you know, lying every minute situation, and that's why he's taping his client, so he has a record of what the client actually said.
Let's pivot to Manafort now. Talk about the significance of the immunity for the 5, why that will make a difficult case even that much harder for Manafort, and what it means.
That's a big deal, because what you have there are 5 persons who are going to testify against Paul Manafort about these various transactions, all of whom believe in good faith that if they were to testify without immunity, they would be giving testimony that tends to incriminate them. So by the time this comes out in front of the jury, what the jury is going to see and hear is that there are 6 people, Mr. Gates and these 5, who believe that they have been participants in a crime with Mr. Manafort. And, you know, as a criminal defense lawyer, I can tell you it gets very hard to defend a case as these immunized witnesses pile up and say, yeah, I was committing a crime, but, you know, I did it with him. You know, the first guy, if there's 1 or 2, maybe you can get away, but 5, 6 people saying I was up to no good with the defendant, the jury figures, well, if there's 6 people willing to say they committed a crime with Mr. Manafort, must have happened. It gets to be very hard to defend a case like that.
Rudy Giuliani says, okay, well, maybe my client will sit down with Mueller, but here are the conditions. He's only talking collusion. There's no obstruction. Is it me, or are they trying to run out the clock here, keep pushing this thing back and back till that magic date in November when we have the midterms? Am I too cynical here, or are they never going to really sit down, his client and Mueller, unless the court makes them?
Richard, you're not cynical enough. Mr. Trump is never, you know, quote me on this, Richard. Mr. Trump is never, ever going to sit for an interview and Rudy Giuliani is never, ever going to let him sit for an interview. This is Brer Rabbit saying, please don't throw me in that briar patch. It's misdirection. You know, Trump has no interest in sitting for an interview, and Mr. Mueller at this point has no interest in compelling it through a subpoena, because every day and every week more evidence pours in that he'd like to ask Trump about. So I think what's going on here is there's this weird game of chicken where Trump wants to delay things because he knows an interview would be terrible for him, and Mueller is willing to play footsie with Trump over the interview and let it delay because every day more evidence rolls in that he wants to ask Trump about.
Well, one final thing, Roland, and that is that that meeting, a bizarre day that we saw in Helsinki with the press conference, but the 2 hours more specifically behind closed doors. Now, leaving aside whether or not the translator kept notes and the accessibility of it, a lot of intelligence people are saying there was a recording of this. There is accessible intel that people can say what happened in those meetings. There's readouts by the Russians, etc. Is it possible at all that Mueller could ever find out what was discussed behind closed doors as being relevant to this investigation?
Sure. If there was some kind of discussion behind closed doors where Trump said something like, you know, thanks so much for your help in clobbering Hillary Clinton so that I could be elected, and let me tell you, I'm going to get rid of the Magnitsky Act as fast as I can. If something like that happened, that would be a pretty clear evidence of a quid pro quo and a crime and a bribe and all the rest of it. There's lots of things that could have been said in that meeting that could, you know, be criminal or evidence of a crime. And if there's a recording, it's not clear how easy it would be for Mueller to get it, particularly if the only recording is in the hands of the Russians. But, you know, Mr. Mueller seems to have a lot of witnesses in a lot of places. And who knows, right?
Well,
who knows?
Until we talk again, but the one thing I do know, between now and next week, there will be another bizarre turn in already this bizarre 2+ years that we've seen. But Roland, I always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be with you.
All right, folks, when we come back, we're going to bring in our legal panel. And you heard our guests talk about what kind of a client Trump must be for Cohen. What about the flip side? What kind of attorney is Cohen that he's recording his own client? We'll get into that and more after this.